Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. What happens when you're working the graveyard shift at 30,000 feet and the person sitting 3 rows behind you isn't supposed to be alive? Security cameras record someone who knows every blind spot in the terminal, someone who shouldn't have access. Someone inside the cockpit pulled every single circuit breaker. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, and the plane was falling, and we had no idea who was responsible. Tonight, I'm sharing 11 real stories from airline employees who have experienced the unimaginable during their night shifts. Some of these employees quit their jobs the very next day after hearing the sound of breathing behind them in an empty aircraft hangar. But when you turn around, nothing is there. These aren't urban legends or spooky tales. They are verified accounts from flight attendants, ground crew maintenance, and stories of mysterious passengers who disappeared, sabotage attempts that almost killed hundreds, and encounters with people who seem to know things they shouldn't know, shared by employees and security personnel who have experienced events that will always haunt them. You'll hear about the MMA fighter who lost his temper at 35,000 feet while passengers screamed in fear, or the maintenance worker who found someone had systematically disabled. If you're ready to hear stories that will make you reevaluate everything you thought you knew about airline safety, hit the subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. These include the security guard who witnessed 3 days of cascading failures that seemed to coordinated to be coincidental, the night shift supervisor who suffered a fatal heart attack after witnessing something so upsetting that his colleagues refused to talk about it to this day, and every safety system on a Boeing 737. After hearing story number 7, I must warn you that you may never feel safe flying again, because sometimes the most terrifying thing about flying isn't the possibility of a crash, but rather the realization that someone on board has been planning something much worse. Let's start with a story that began like any other night. I don't want you to miss what's coming up next on Verified Fears. Let's move on to our first story. Sophia Rodriguez had been a night shift flight attendant for Delta Airlines for more than 8 years, and she believed she had seen it all. She worked on red-eye flights from Los Angeles to Atlanta, where she dealt with inebriated businessmen who were crying babies and the occasional medical emergency. However, nothing in her training had prepared her for this, helped her prepare for what transpired on Flight 1247 on a chilly Tuesday evening in October. The Boeing 757 was only half full, as was customary for the departure at 11:47 p.m. Sophia was working with only one other flight attendant, Marcus, a 15-year veteran who had asked for the night shifts because all appeared normal during the safety demonstration, with passengers settling in and most already pulling out their phones for a final check before takeoff. Sophia was making her final walk through the cabin, making sure seat belts were fastened and tray tables were up, when she noticed him for the first time. Normally, they were quieter as passengers boarded. Sophia noticed the typical mix of business travelers trying to catch some sleep and a few tourists heading back east after their California vacation, while other passengers were rearranging their seats, reaching for magazines, or having quiet conversations. 14C, a middle-aged man in a dark business suit, likely in his 50s, with graying hair and pale skin, sat perfectly upright, staring straight ahead at the seat back in front of him. His hands were folded precisely in his lap, and he hadn't moved since she began her walkthrough. Sophia stopped next to his row and said, "Sir, we're going to be leaving soon. Please make sure your seat belt is securely fastened. The man didn't answer or even blink, so Sophia leaned closer, thinking maybe he was wearing earbuds, but she couldn't see, and then noticed something that made her stomach drop. The man wasn't breathing his chest. There was no slight movement, no indication of life at all, and it wasn't rising and falling. Sophia's training began right away. She had handled medical emergencies before, including heart attacks, seizures, and even a death in flight. But those cases always involved some sort of distress call, someone noticing a passenger in trouble, or clear indications of a medical crisis. This man had evidently boarded the plane, taken his seat, and died without anybody knowing. Marcus, Sophia whispered to her colleague, who was looking at the overhead bins 3 rows ahead. I need you here. Marcus came over with the easy assurance of someone who had dealt with numerous small problems over the years. But when Sophia whispered what she had seen, his expression completely changed. Are you sure? Marcus asked, bending down to examine the passenger more intently. At that moment, they both noticed something even more unsettling. The man's skin had a waxy artificial. When Marcus carefully reached out to check for a pulse at the man's wrist, the skin was cold to the touch. Jesus Christ, Marcus whispered, pulling his hand back. Sophia, not the pale complexion of someone who might be ill, but the unmistakable appearance of someone who had been dead 4 hours. His lips had a slight blue tinge. Sophia's mind was racing. She had seen people show their boarding passes, walk down the jet bridge to find their seats, and watch the boarding process. She couldn't recall seeing this man board specifically, but that wasn't unusual. There were over 100 passengers, and she didn't memorize every face. But how had he passed security if he had been dead 4 hours, as Marcus suggested? How had he shown his boarding pass? How had he boarded the aircraft and taken his seat? We need to contact the captain immediately, Sophia said. But Marcus was already reaching for the telephone. As Marcus spoke softly to Captain Rodriguez, Sophia found herself staring at the deceased traveler, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The man's eyes were open, looking straight ahead with a glassy, unfocused gaze. His mouth was slightly open, as though he had been about to say something when he died. But what was most unsettling was his perfectly straight posture, hands folded, seatbelt fastened, as though someone had deliberately placed him to appear like a typical traveler. Captain Rodriguez's voice called on the interphone, requesting that Sophia come to the Captain Rodriguez's calm but serious voice said, "You have a deceased passenger in 14C, but there's a problem with that." She moved forward in the cockpit right away, her legs feeling unsteady as she tried to keep her professional composure while her mind struggled to process what was happening. Sophia responded, "What kind of problem?" I reviewed our passenger manifest and found that seat 14C is listed as vacant. Our records show that this seat was never sold for this flight. So Sophia felt the blood drain from her cheeks, indicating that there couldn't possibly be someone seated there at the moment. Sophia understood the implication that either their systems had failed catastrophically, or that someone who hadn't bought a ticket hadn't gone through security. "I believe you." Captain Rodriguez stated that we have 127 passengers on board, which matches exactly with the number of boarding passes scanned. If someone is in 14C, then either our count is incorrect or he didn't finish the sentence. The captain asked, "What do you want us to do?" Sophia said, "I'm not taking off with an unaccounted passenger, especially under these circumstances, but I need you to do something for me. I want you to go back and take a photo of this passenger with your phone and hadn't scanned a boarding pass, had boarded their aircraft, and appeared to have been dead 4 hours." Sophia nodded and started to return through the cabin, but some of the passengers were looking restless, checking their watches and wondering why they hadn't started taxiing yet. She tried to smile reassuringly as she went by, but her heart was racing. When she got to row 14, she stopped dead in her tracks. The seat was empty, and Sophia stared at the empty seat. "I need documentation of this," Sophia said. "Marcus," she called, trying to keep her voice low enough not to alarm the other passengers. The seat belt was still fastened, but buckled around, nothing, and the seat was in the same upright position, but no one was sitting in it. She looked around frantically, thinking maybe the man had gotten up to use the restroom, but she hadn't seen anyone pass her in the narrow aisle. Marcus hurried over when he saw I've been watching this part of the cabin since you left, and nobody has left their seats. They both stood there staring at the empty seat, trying to comprehend what had happened. His face turned white. Where did he go? I don't know. I was only gone for 3 minutes or maybe 4. Did you stay here the entire time? Excuse me, Sophia remarked to the young woman, wearing headphones in 14A as she looked up at them suspiciously. Did you see the gentleman who was sitting next to you get up? She said, taking out one earphone. What gentleman? Sophia and Marcus exchanged looks. Mum, are you sure there was a man in a dark suit sitting right there just a few minutes ago? The woman looked at them like they were crazy. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes. That seat has been empty since I sat down. I was actually relieved about it because I thought I'd have more room. Sophia turned to the couple in row 15 and said, Excuse me, did either of you notice a man sitting in the seat in front of you on 4C? The husband looked confused. No, that seat has been empty. We were just sitting there. Marcus leaned down and whispered to Sophia. That seat has been empty the entire time, remarking on how fortunate the woman in 14A was to have extra space. Sophia felt as though she was going crazy. She and Marcus had both seen the man and had noticed that he seemed to be dead. Marcus had touched his icy skin, but now that he was gone, other passengers were adamant that he had never been there at all. Sophia, Marcus said softly, we need to check. Perhaps he woke up while we were both preoccupied. They promptly made sure both restrooms in their area were empty. They asked the people near the restrooms if they had seen anyone enter, but no one had. Sophia even asked the people in the very back of the aircraft if they had seen a man in a dark suit pass by them, but the man had just disappeared. Captain Rodriguez's voice could be heard over the asking for an update over the interphone once more, and Sophia answered it with shaking hands. Captain, the passenger is gone. What do you mean gone? I mean, the seat is empty, and the other passengers are saying that no one was ever seated there. There was a lengthy silence. Sophia, are you telling me that you and Marcus both observed a deceased passenger who our manifest states that he shouldn't have been on the plane? And now that the passenger has vanished and other passengers say he never was? Yes, sir. That's precisely what I'm telling you. We're still heading back to the gate, and I want security to board the aircraft and perform a thorough search. Sophia, I want you and Marcus to record everything you remember about this passenger. Every detail. We're going to need a detailed report. As the plane taxied back to the gate, Sophia attempted to piece together what had happened. She could still vividly recall the man's appearance, including his dark suit, graying hair, and pale, waxy skin. She also remembered the cold touch of his skin when Marcus checked for a pulse. She also remembered his glassy, staring eyes and the way he sat motionless, like a mannequin placed to look like a passenger. But now she was beginning to question whether she had actually seen what she believed she had seen. Could it be that the stress of working night shifts and the dim lighting in the cabin had made her hallucinate? Marcus had also seen him, touched him, and verified that the man was dead. When they arrived at the gate, airport security boarded right away and thoroughly searched the security chief, a strict woman named Detective Morrison, interviewed Sophia and Marcus separately. Sophia recounted her story exactly as she remembered it, giving as much detail as possible. The entire aircraft was checked, checking every seat, restroom, and storage compartment. They found nothing, except that the seat belt was still fastened. I've been working here for 12 years, and I've witnessed a lot of weird things happen at airports, But what you're describing is impossible. A deceased person cannot board an aircraft, pass through security, present a boarding pass, or take a seat. And they most definitely cannot. Detective Morrison looked at her with a mixture of skepticism and concern when she finished speaking about the man's appearance and condition. Sophia said, "I know how it sounds, but I know what I saw. Marcus saw too." "Yes, Mr. Thompson confirmed your story, which is the only reason I'm not completely discounting it, but I need you to think about the possibility that you both had some sort of shared hallucination or misperception." Sophia wanted to argue, but she was beginning to wonder the same thing herself. Detective Morrison went on. How could what she had experienced be real? "I'm going to review all the security footage from the gate area and the jet bridge. If someone boarded this aircraft who wasn't supposed to be there, we'll find evidence of it. But Miss Rodriguez, if we don't find anything, I think you should consider talking to someone about the stress you might be under." The security review took 2 hours, and they looked at footage from every camera angle, examined the scans of the boarding passes, and compared the passenger manifest with the actual head count. Everything matched exactly. 127 passengers had boarded the aircraft, and 127 passengers were accounted for. Detective Morrison did discover something that caused her to re-evaluate Sophia's account, though. "Miss Rodriguez, I need to show you something," she said, pulling up a security video clip on her laptop that said, "This was captured by the jet bridge camera approximately 10 minutes prior to your planned departure, after every passenger had boarded." The video showed the empty jet bridge. For a few seconds, nothing happened, and then for a few frames, there seemed to be a shadow moving down the jet bridge's wall. Shows a shadow rather than a person, as though someone was crossing it but couldn't be seen by the camera. "Do you see that?" Sophia leaned closer to the screen where the shadow was moving, seemingly as if someone was walking. But no one was present when Detective Morrison asked. "The odd thing is that this shadow seems to be traveling toward the plane rather than away from it. This was captured after the last passenger count, when the jet bridge should have been empty." Sophia felt a shiver down her spine. "What do you think it means?" Detective Morrison shut down the laptop. "But I'm not sure. It might be a camera malfunction." The flight was eventually cancelled. The passengers were rescheduled on other flights, and the aircraft was taken out of service for a thorough inspection. Nothing unusual was discovered. Sophia and Marcus were both given a week of paid leave to recuperate from the incident, and when Sophia returned to work, she asked to be moved to day shifts. But the story doesn't end there. 3 months later, Detective Morrison called Sophia because another flight attendant who worked for a different airline had reported a nearly identical incident: a deceased passenger in a seat that was supposed to be empty, who then disappeared without a trace. The details were so similar that Detective Morrison wondered the airline industry quietly started calling these incidents phantom passenger cases if there was a connection. Over the course of the following year, Detective Morrison documented 6 more similar incidents across various airlines and airports, all on night flights, all involving a passenger who appeared to be dead, sitting in a seat that wasn't supposed to be occupied, and all ending with the passenger's mysterious disappearance and other passengers insisting no one had ever been there. Although the phenomenon was never officially acknowledged, no press releases or public statements were made. Word got out among night shift crews, and flight attendants started closely examining passenger manifests, paying particular attention to those who appeared too quiet or motionless. Sophia never saw the man in the dark suit again, but occasionally during her day shifts, she would find herself scanning the passengers for that telltale stillness, that waxy skin, those glassy staring eyes, and occasionally in the middle of the night when she couldn't sleep, she would ask herself, who was he? How did he get on that plane? And most disturbing of all, where did he go? The official report described the incident as an unexplained passenger discrepancy, and it was stored in a database that only a select few people could access. However, Sophia is aware of what she saw, Marcus is aware of what he touched, and Detective Morrison is aware that sometimes events in the sky cannot be explained by reason or logic. The man in seat 14C is still unknown, but he serves as a reminder to those who work the night shift in aviation that sometimes the impossible is possible at 30,000 feet in the dark between destinations. And that's only the start of what airline employees go through at night. Let's move on to our second story. David Chen had been employed for 6 years at Denver International Airport doing aircraft maintenance for United Airlines. He had become used to the spooky atmosphere of the overnight shift, where the enormous hangars were darkly lit after midnight and represented the skeletal bodies of grounded aircraft undergoing routine inspections and repairs. Most mechanics preferred the day shift, but David, the only thing he didn't love was what happened on a cold November night that would make him doubt all he believed he understood about the aircraft he serviced. It was 2:17 a.m. He truly enjoyed the isolation and the premium pay that came with working the graveyard hours. When David was given his nightly task, he was to do a standard examination on a Boeing 777. The aircraft, tail number an 847UA, had just finished a red-eye flight from Tokyo. It was parked in Hangar 7, one of DEN's older maintenance facilities. The hangar was large, with a ceiling that vanished into shadows despite the overhead lights being on. David had worked on hundreds of aircraft in this hangar, but something felt off as he approached the 777 that night. The first thing he noticed was how quiet it was, which is usually the case even hours after landing an aircraft. David started his routine exterior inspection by walking around the aircraft with his flashlight and checklist. Normally, aircraft would still make faint settling noises, such as metal contracting as it cooled hydraulic systems or the soft hum of auxiliary power units, but this 777 was completely silent, as if it had been sitting there 4 days, rather than having just arrived from an international flight. When he went to check the cargo holds, he heard footsteps coming from inside the aircraft, specifically from the passenger cabin above him. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and moving from the front of the plane toward the back. Everything else seemed normal, including the landing gear and the fuselage engines, which showed no signs of stress or unusual wear. David paused and paid close attention to the sound of footsteps moving down the middle aisle of the aircraft. At first, he assumed that a cleaning crew was still working inside the aircraft because cleaning often went on late into the night, especially after lengthy international flights. However, when he looked at his work order, he saw no indication of cleaning crew activity. David used his security badge to unlock the door and climbed the stairs into the cabin. The interior of the 777 was completely dark except for the emergency lighting strips along the floor. He walked to the front of the aircraft, where the boarding stairs were still attached, and the cabin door was closed and locked, as was standard procedure for aircraft in maintenance. The schedule stated that the aircraft had been cleaned and cleared hours earlier. "Hey, maintenance, is anyone still working in the cabin?" He turned on his flashlight and started to walk through the first-class area. The seats were all upright, the tray tables were stowed, and everything was as neat and orderly as it should have been after cleaning. But as he got farther inside the plane, David noticed a musty, stale smell that made his stomach turn, similar to old clothing that had been kept in a damp basement for years. David continued through business class and into the main economy cabin. As he approached the back of the aircraft, he noticed that the temperature seemed to be dropping and that his breath was starting to fog in the flashlight beam. At that point, he heard footsteps again, this time coming from the upper deck of the 777. However, David was aware that was not feasible because this specific aircraft configuration did not have passenger seating on the upper deck. Instead, it was solely utilized for crew rest areas and storage. More significantly, there was no way to reach the upper deck without entering the main cabin, and David had just crossed the entire plane without seeing anyone. He could now clearly hear footsteps moving methodically from one end of the upper deck to the other. David found the access ladder to the upper deck and climbed up his flashlight beam, dancing ahead of him. The upper deck was divided into several small crew rest compartments, each with bunk beds. There was a distinct sound of someone wearing hard-soled shoes walking on the aircraft's flooring. But there was something off with the rhythm. The steps were too slow and deliberate, as if whoever was walking was having trouble moving. David systematically checked each compartment for pilots and flight attendants on long-haul flights, but they were all empty. The footsteps had stopped, so he stood in the upper deck's narrow corridor and listened intently. The only sound in the room now was his own breathing, but the smell was stronger and nearly overwhelming up here. It wasn't just mustiness. At the far end of the upper deck corridor, barely visible in the dim emergency lighting, there were wet footprints on the carpet. David carefully approached the footprints, focusing his flashlight beam on the floor, and saw clearly the outline of dress shoes in sizes 10 or 11. There was something else, something organic and unpleasant, that he couldn't identify, and he was about to head back down when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. David knelt down and took a closer look at the prints. The liquid had a metallic smell that blended sickeningly with a musty odor that permeated the upper deck. Although he was not an expert, the dark liquid looked unsettlingly like blood. The prints were not made with water, though, and they were dark, almost black, and had a thick, viscous consistency. Quickly getting to his feet, David traced the footprints back to their origin, which led him to the last crew rest compartment on the left side of the aircraft. The door of the compartment was closed, but David could see that a dark liquid had leaked out from underneath it. His training instructed him to contact security right away, because whatever was in that compartment shouldn't be handled by a maintenance worker alone. But his curiosity and sense of duty for the aircraft overcame this. His caution caused him to reach for the handle of the compartment door, but it was locked. He tried his master key, but it wouldn't turn, and he tried his security badge on the electronic lock, but it displayed a red light that said access denied. This was odd because, during inspections, maintenance staff were supposed to have access to every part of the aircraft. As David stood there attempting to open the door, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. The sound of laborious, ragged breathing, not the steady breathing of someone sleeping, came from within the compartment. It sounded like someone was having trouble breathing. "Hello, are you okay in there? This is maintenance. I can get you out," David called, pressing his ear to the door. As soon as the breathing stopped, David waited for a response, but none came. He tried the door handle again, pushing his entire weight behind it, but it wouldn't move, and the electronic lock kept showing a red light. At that point, he heard footsteps again, but they weren't the slow, deliberate steps he had heard before. David backed away from the door, his hands shaking, reaching for his radio to call security, but before he could do so, the sounds from the compartment abruptly stopped. He had heard these before, but they were fast and frantic, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the small compartment. The footsteps were accompanied by a scraping sound like fingernails being dragged across metal. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, David stood in the hallway waiting for something to happen. When nothing happened, he headed back down to the main cabin, his mind racing with questions about what or who was in that compartment, why he couldn't access it with his master key, and what was the dark liquid that had leaked out onto the corridor floor. Back in the main cabin, David tried to concentrate on finishing his inspection, but he was unable to do so. Every few minutes, he would pause and listen for sounds coming from above, but the aircraft was silent. The musty smell had subsided a little, but David could still smell it in the air. David noticed something while he was checking the galley area. Other than that, the Tokyo flight's passenger manifest was still attached to a clipboard close to the forward galley. David wasn't supposed to look at the passenger information, but he felt compelled to do so. The manifest listed 347 passengers and 16 crew members for the trip, but at the bottom, someone had written in red ink, "Additional passenger upper deck, passenger upper deck. Please do not disrupt compartment 7L." The notation made no sense in accordance with any airline protocol David was familiar with, so he took a picture of the manifest with his camera. Descendant 7L was exactly where he'd heard the breathing, and found the locked door, David said. But passengers weren't allowed in crew rest areas, and definitely not in the upper deck compartments. "I need you to come to Hangar 7, because I have a situation with the 777 from Tokyo." "What kind of situation is it?" Mike asked. "I think there might be someone still on board in one of the upper deck crew compartments, but the door is locked and I can't get access." There was a pause. "David, but that's not possible." He then called his supervisor Mike Rodriguez, who was working in another hangar. Mike stated that while waiting for his supervisor David to finish his exterior inspection, he decided to take another look around the aircraft. "I heard breathing coming from compartment 7L, and there is a note on the passenger manifest about an additional passenger in that exact location. I know how it sounds, but everyone is accounted for. Cleared by customs and cleaning crew hours ago." Mike arrived 20 minutes later with 2 security guards, and David showed them the locked compartment door. The dark liquid was still visible on the carpet, but it appeared to have dried a little. At that time, Mike was paying closer attention to any indications that someone might have accessed the upper deck from outside. But the 777's upper deck had no external access points. The only way in or out was through the main cabin. "What is that substance, Jesus?" Mike tried his master key on the compartment door, but like David, he was unable to get it to open. The security guards tried their override codes on the electronic lock, but the stains persisted. One of the security guards asked, kneeling down to examine the stains. "I was hoping you could tell me," David replied. While they waited, David showed them the passenger manifest with the enigmatic notation about compartment 7L. "I've never seen anything like this," Mike said, looking over the manifest. "A red light doesn't make sense," he said. "These locks aren't supposed to deny access to maintenance or security personnel." The locksmith arrived an hour later and worked on the compartment door for 45 minutes. When he finally got it open, everyone held their breath, expecting to find someone inside. However, the small space was unclean and smelled of the same musty odor David had smelled. Passengers are not assigned to crew rest areas, and they are definitely not marked as do not disturb. This must be some sort of error. The bedding was unkempt and stained with the same dark liquid that had been on the corridor floor. The walls of the compartment were scratched as though someone had been clawing at them, and most unsettling of all, the words "I couldn't get out" were written on the wall in what appeared to be the same dark liquid. Previously, however, it was combined with something else, the unmistakable smell of decay. A team of investigators from the FBI and the airline security department descended on Hangar 7. Both of the security guards immediately called for a thorough investigation. They spent 3 days inspecting every inch of the 777, gathering samples of the dark liquid, examining the scratches on the compartment walls, and speaking with everyone who had been involved with the incident. Flight. The investigation's findings were conflicting and extremely concerning. The dark liquid was identified as human blood, but the lab analysis showed that it was at least a few weeks old. The wall scratches matched human fingernails, and the DNA analysis of the material discovered beneath the scratches demonstrated that someone had been trapped in the compartment and had made a valiant attempt to claw their way out. Security footage from both airports revealed no indication of anyone hiding on the aircraft or gaining access to the upper deck compartments. But this is where the story becomes genuinely inexplicable. The passenger manifest for the Tokyo flight was authentic, and all 347 passengers and 16 crew members were accounted for. Every person who boarded the aircraft in Tokyo was verified to have deplaned in Denver. The enigmatic notation regarding The handwriting analysis was inconclusive because it did not match any of the crew members or ground personnel who had access to the aircraft. And the most perplexing aspect of all was the age of the blood evidence. If someone had been trapped in compartment 7L and had died there, it would have been written in red ink that matched a pen found in the galley. Occurred weeks prior to the Tokyo flight, but the aircraft had been thoroughly inspected and cleaned every day during that time. How could a body have been concealed in a crew rest compartment for weeks without anyone noticing? The investigation was ultimately closed without providing any conclusive answers, and the official report claimed that unidentified biological material had been discovered in the 777 was returned to service after thorough cleaning and decontamination, but no explanation was given as to how it got there or who it came from. David never worked on that specific aircraft again after requesting to be assigned to other planes, which his supervisor duly complied with. However, the experience altered him, making him more watchful during inspections and constantly listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. A fellow maintenance worker revealed that the same 777 had been involved in an incident the year before, in which a passenger on a flight from Los Angeles to Tokyo had vanished during the flight. The man had been seen boarding the aircraft, but his seat had been occupied during takeoff. 6 months after learning this, David discovered something that further complicated the mystery. The missing passenger, Robert Chen, had no connection to David, despite having the same last name. He was described as a quiet man in his 50s and had been assigned to seat to 3F in economy class. But when the plane landed in Tokyo, he was nowhere to be found. The passenger was never found, and the case remained unsolved. Since he was feeling cramped in the main cabin, he had requested an upgrade to the upper deck crew rest area. Of course, passengers were not permitted in crew rest areas in any situation, but David couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if Robert Chen had managed to get to the upper deck anyhow, or if he had somehow become stuck in compartment 7L on that flight from Los Angeles to Tokyo. David attempted to move past the incident, but it haunted his dreams occasionally during his night shifts. The timeline would match the age of the blood evidence, explain the desperate scratches on the walls, the blood-written message, and the breathing sounds David had heard, but it wouldn't explain how Robert Chen's body had vanished or how he had initially gained access to a locked compartment. As far as David knew, no other maintenance workers reported any unusual incidents, but he couldn't get rid of the feeling that whatever had happened in compartment 7L wasn't over. The aircraft carried the memory of Robert Chen's final moments, and occasionally in the darkness of the 777, he continued to listen to the cabins above even though he never heard them again. David never forgot the night he heard footsteps above and realized that some passengers never actually leave their flights. He learned that airplanes, like old houses, can hold on to the echoes of tragedy, and in the quiet hours before dawn, when the hangars are empty and the planes sit silent in the darkness, those echoes sometimes turn into footsteps. David still works at Denver International Airport, where that memory became manifest. David Chen always checks the upper deck compartments twice during his inspections, and never works alone because, despite the official records stating that Robert Chen vanished somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, he never left at 777, and is still walking the upper deck looking for a way out of compartment 7L, leaving bloody footprints that disappear in the morning but reappear when darkness falls again. Let's move on to our third story. Maria Santos has worked as a gate agent for Southwest Airlines at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport for 12 years, and she took pride in her ability to handle any passenger situation with professionalism and grace. Working the night shift meant juggling tired, irate passengers, delayed flights, and the occasional rowdy passenger, but she believed she had seen it all until the night she encountered. It was 1:43 a.m. when the woman with the sand on her shoes appeared. Maria could see the fatigue on the faces of the passengers as they disembarked from Flight 2847 from Albuquerque, which was nearly 2 hours behind schedule due to weather delays, on a Tuesday in late September. The majority of the passengers were either business travelers or tourists returning home from a trip to New Mexico. As the final few passengers got off the jet bridge, Maria noticed a woman who appeared to be having trouble with her carry-on bag. She was likely in her early 40s and was dressed in an expensive-looking but somewhat rumpled beige suit. This was the typical mix for this route, and Maria was getting ready for the quick turnaround. The same aircraft would be leaving for San Diego in just over an hour. Maria was immediately struck by how pale the woman appeared, almost grey, as if she hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Her dark hair was pulled back in what had likely been a neat bun just hours before, but now strands were falling loose around her face. "Mum, do you need assistance with your bag?" Maria asked, approaching the woman. "I think I'm lost," the woman said, her eyes glassy and unfocused, her voice barely above a whisper as Maria looked at her boarding pass, which she was holding in her free hand. "You're in Phoenix, ma'am. Are you meeting someone here, or do you need directions to baggage claim Phoenix?" Maria had previously dealt with confused passengers, including elderly travelers with dementia, people on medication, and tired business travelers who had lost track of their itinerary. But something about this woman felt different. There was a quality to her confusion that seemed deeper than simple disorientation. The woman repeated the word as if she had never heard it before. "But I can't remember where I was supposed to go." "Let me assist you in figuring this out," Maria said softly. "What's your name?" The woman looked at Maria for a long time before responding. "Rebecca Morrison." "I believe you believe," Maria said. "I'm sorry. I'm just very tired. It's been a long trip." Maria checked the boarding pass once more, and the name printed there was, in fact, Rebecca Morrison, seat 12A. Leaving from everything appeared normal in Albuquerque, but Maria couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. "Mrs. Morrison, do you recall why you were traveling to Phoenix for work or pleasure?" Rebecca Morrison looked down at her hands, which Maria saw were trembling a little. "I was seeing someone significant, but I can't. The specifics are unclear." But as they were conversing, Maria heard an odd noise, a gentle, rhythmic scraping sound that seemed to be coming from the woman's feet. Glancing down, Maria noticed that Rebecca was wearing black dress shoes that looked to be covered in sand. With every slight movement, grains of sand fell from her shoes onto the polished floor of the airport. "Mrs. Morrison, have you recently visited the beach?" Maria inquired, even though she was aware that there were no beaches in the Albuquerque area. Rebecca gazed down at her feet, as though she had never seen sand before. She couldn't recall ever having visited a beach. The sand wasn't just on her shoes, though. Maria noticed it was embedded in the cuffs of "I think you might want to sit down for a moment," Maria said, leading Rebecca to a nearby chair in the gate area. "Can I get you some water?" she asked, her pants dusting the bottom of her carry-on bag and even getting caught in the strands of her hair that had fallen out of her bun. It looked like Rebecca Morrison had been walking through sand 4 hours. Rebecca nodded appreciatively and sank into the chair, but as she did so, more sand spilled onto the floor from her clothes. Maria went to the gate desk to get a bottle of water and to check something that had been bothering her. Maria opened the flight to 847 passenger manifest on her computer and saw that Rebecca Morrison was listed in C12A, exactly as her boarding pass had said. But something didn't make sense when she looked at the check-in information. The system indicated that Rebecca Morrison had checked in for the flight in Albuquerque at 3:17 p.m. But because of weather delays, the flight hadn't even started boarding until 11:30 p.m. Where had Rebecca Morrison been for more than 8 hours between check-in and boarding? Maria returned to Mrs. Morrison. "Here's some water. Are you feeling better?" Rebecca turned to face Maria, and for a brief moment, her eyes appeared clearer and more focused. "You're very kind. and I apologize for being such trouble. I found Rebecca, staring blankly at the window overlooking the tarmac. The woman appeared to be watching something in the distance, but Maria couldn't see anything unusual outside. That doesn't make sense, does it? I was on a plane when Maria felt a chill go down her spine. Mrs. Morrison, do you remember boarding the flight in Albuquerque? Rebecca was silent for a while, her brow furrowed in concentration. I feel like I've been walking for a very long time, when she asked gently through miles and miles of desert. As Rebecca talked, Maria noticed that the sand surrounding her chair was accumulating into a small pile. It wasn't just falling off her clothes anymore. It seemed to be appearing out of nowhere on her shoulders and her hair on her hands. I remember being at the airport as well, but everything after that was like a dream, a long, hot dream. Rebecca's voice was getting progressively softer, but I believe I was meant to meet someone who was waiting for me. Mrs. Morrison, I think we should call someone for you. Do you have family in Phoenix who was expecting you? I don't remember. Maria was about to recommend calling medical services when her computer rang with an incoming message. It was a brief but concerning message from the gate agent in Albuquerque, who had handled the departure of Flight 2847. I need to talk to you about passenger Morrison. Maria excused herself and called the Albuquerque airport. The gate agent who answered, Carlos Valdez, sounded shaken. Thank God you called. I need to talk to you about Rebecca Morrison. There was a lengthy silence before Carlos responded. Maria, Rebecca Morrison never boarded that flight. What do you mean she's sitting right here with a valid excuse? Did she make it to Phoenix? She's here now, but something's wrong with her, Carlos said. She seems confused, disoriented, and covered in sand. She checked in at 3:17 p.m., as your system indicates, but she never arrived at the gate. We called her name several times while she was boarding, but she was a no-show, and her seat was empty as we left, and Maria felt the blood drain from her face. Carlos, that's not possible. She's here. She has her boarding pass, and she got off the plane with the other passengers. I'm watching the security footage now, and I can see that Rebecca Morrison's seat, 12A, was empty the entire time. Maria turned to face Rebecca, who was still seated in the chair, and she noticed that more sand was somehow building up around her feet. If she hadn't boarded in, I'm not sure how Albuquerque got to Phoenix, but Maria, there's more. We discovered Rebecca Morrison's car in our long-term parking lot yesterday afternoon, but the problem is that it's completely covered in sand, not just dust, but buried like it's been sitting in the desert for months. As she hung up, her hands were shaking. Mrs. Morrison, Maria said carefully, I need to ask you something. Are you sure you were on that flight from Albuquerque? She asked herself as she walked back to Rebecca, trying to comprehend what she had just learned. If Rebecca Morrison hadn't boarded the flight in Albuquerque, and her seat had been empty the entire way, how was she here? And how had she obtained a boarding pass for a flight she never took? The more I try to recall, the less certain I get. I remember walking a lot through sand, heat, and emptiness. Where were you walking to here? Rebecca asked, looking up at Maria with those glassy and focused eyes. I was walking here to Phoenix to catch my flight, but Mrs. Morrison, Rebecca said simply, I missed my trip, didn't I? I was meant to be on a plane, but I missed it, so I had to walk instead. Mrs. Morrison, you can't walk from Albuquerque to Phoenix. Rebecca got up abruptly, sand pouring from her clothing like a tiny waterfall. But I did walk, Rebecca said, her voice growing more agitated. Through the night and through the day and through another night, I couldn't stop walking because I had to catch my flight. Albuquerque to Phoenix is more than 200 meters through the desert. Maria watched in horror. As more sand. I have to go now, Rebecca said. Scooping up her carry-on bag, I have to catch my connecting flight. As she spoke, the woman was turning into a human sandstorm, leaving a path of desert sand across the immaculate airport floor. The sand started to pour from her mouth, her pockets, and her hair. Mrs. Morrison, hold on. Hold on. Phoenix was your destination, and you don't have a connecting flight. However, Rebecca was already making her way toward the main terminal, leaving sand footprints with each step. Maria could hear the woman's gentle scraping sound becoming progressively quieter as she vanished into the throng of late-night travelers. Maria called airport security right away and gave them Rebecca's. The maintenance crew had to bring in specialized equipment to clean up the pile because the sand was real. But when they looked at the security cameras, they discovered something impossible. The footage showed Maria talking to an empty chair and clearly handing a bottle of water to no one, while she was talking to nothing and appeared worried about something that wasn't there. Of desert sand that had gathered around the chair where Rebecca Morrison had been sitting, analysis of the sand revealed that it contained minerals and plant matter typical of the sauna and desert between Albuquerque and Phoenix. The ensuing investigation turned up more unsettling information, including the fact that Rebecca Morrison had actually checked in for flight to 847 in Albuquerque, but the security footage showed her search and rescue personnel discovered Rebecca Morrison's body 3 days later, around 50 meters into the desert between Albuquerque and Phoenix, after she left the airport shortly after check-in, according to her mobile phone's GPS data, and drove into the desert east of Albuquerque, where the signal was lost at 4:30 p.m. Rebecca Morrison had attempted to walk from Albuquerque to Phoenix after her car ran out of gas on a remote desert road. Rather than waiting for help, she apparently chose to walk to her destination, making it about a quarter of the way before the desert claimed her life. The medical examiner estimated that she had died from exposure and dehydration approximately 36 hours before Maria met her at the Phoenix airport. However, after that night, when she was unable to explain what she had gone through and the security footage made her doubt her own sanity, some part of Rebecca Morrison had somehow finished the journey. She had walked through death itself to catch her flight, arriving at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport as a passenger who had never boarded, carrying the sand of her final journey in her shoes and in her hair. Maria asked to be transferred to day shifts. Although the gate area at 7 was thoroughly cleaned and renovated following the incident, maintenance workers still occasionally discover small piles of sand near the chairs where passengers wait for their flights, and occasionally late at night, gate agents report seeing a woman in beige pants. Nevertheless, she was aware of what she had seen, heard, and felt when she gave that bottle of water to a woman who had been dead for more than a day. The official report classified the incident as a passenger. Rebecca Morrison, wearing a suit, was walking through the terminal, always heading toward the departure gates, and carrying a boarding pass for a flight she would never catch. Her determination to reach her destination had been stronger than death itself, and she had walked through the desert, through the boundary between life and death, and through the impossible, driven by the simple human need to complete her journey. Service irregularity, and was stored in a database that only a select few can access. But Maria Santos is aware that sometimes our will to reach our destination is so strong that death cannot stop us from attempting to board our flight. If you know where to look, you can still see Rebecca Morrison's footprints in the sand between Albuquerque and Phoenix, which lead to her final resting place. Now, let's move on to the fourth story. Jake Thompson had been working airport security at Chicago O'Hare for 9 years, and he believed he knew every inch of Terminal 3, working the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, where a woman with sand in her shoes is still attempting to catch her connecting flight at Gate 7. It was 3:22 a.m., and he was in charge of keeping an eye on security cameras, making sporadic patrols, and making sure that one of the busiest airports in the world stayed secure during the quiet hours when most passengers were either sleeping or catching red-eye flights. In December, on a Thursday, Jake, the terminal was almost deserted at this hour, with only a few passengers strewn about the gate areas waiting for early morning departures. when Jake first noticed something strange on camera 47, which monitored the long corridor leading to gates K1 through K8. However, Jake's attention was drawn to a figure moving slowly down the corridor, someone wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt that completely covered their face. Not only did the person wear concealing clothing, but they also walked with perfect awareness of each security camera's location, staying just outside of each camera's field of view so that their face was never clearly captured. This wasn't the behavior of a typical traveler. Rather, it was someone who had thoroughly studied the airport security layout. Jake alternated between various camera angles, attempting to get a better look at the hooded figure. But regardless of the camera he used, the person seemed to know exactly where the blind spots were. They moved through the terminal like a ghost, always staying just out of sight control. This is Thompson Jake, who radioed to the main security office, saying, "I have a suspicious individual in the terminal, felt different at this hour." Jake left his monitoring station and started walking toward Concourse K, keeping his radio ready. Someone who knows our camera positions way too well, copying Thompson, is wearing a hood and staying in the camera blind spots. However, whoever this is has intimate knowledge of our security setup. When Jake arrived at the KCO course, it seemed to be completely deserted. He walked the entire length of the corridor, checking every gate area, restroom, and alcove where someone might be. The normal bustle of daytime travel was replaced by an eerie quiet that was only disturbed by the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of cleaning equipment. Jake was about to return to his station when he noticed something that made his blood run cold on the floor near gate K4. There were wet footprints leading from the corridor toward the gate seating area, but it hadn't been raining, and the terminal's floors were dry everywhere else. Perhaps this didn't reveal anything, but the hooded figure had disappeared as mysteriously as they had appeared. Jake found that the wet prints led straight to the boarding area of gate K4 before stopping suddenly at the windows that overlooked the tarmac. The prints were distinct and clearly showed the outline of work boots in sizes 11 or 12, but they ended at the window as though the person who had been walking had just walked through it and vanished onto the tarmac below. Jake looked out the window at the tarmac gate K4, which was currently empty and devoid of any aircraft. Had till 6:15 a.m. to arrive or depart. "I need you to check over camera 47 from the last 10 minutes. The hooded person was nowhere to be seen. The area below was well lit by floodlights, and Jake could see the entire area perfectly. I'm watching the video now, and it's impossible because the person you are following doesn't appear on any of our cameras. I can see you moving through the concourse, but there isn't anyone else in it." Jake felt a shiver go down his spine because he saw wet footprints, which means that someone was present. "I believe you, Thompson, but I'm telling you that our cameras don't show anyone else in that area except you." Jake used his phone to take pictures of the footprints and carried on searching the K concourse, but he couldn't find anything. The hooded figure had just disappeared, leaving behind only wet footprints that led to nowhere. Jake ran into cleaning crew supervisor Elena Vasquez on his way back to his station. Jake was working the overnight shift. "About 20 minutes ago," Elena asked one of my crew members, "did you see someone in a hoodie?" Carlos replied, "He saw someone suspicious near the K gates." "Where's Carlos now?" "I need to talk to him." Elena looked perplexed. "Which is the problem?" "He was supposed to be cleaning the K concourse, but he isn't answering his radio." When Jake and Elena searched Terminal 3, they discovered Carlos's cleaning cart abandoned near gate K6. His radio was on the floor next to the cart, and Carlos's jacket was draped over it. However, there was no sign of the man himself. Elena inquired as to how long Carlos had been employed here. Jake replied that it had been about 3 years. "He's one of our most dependable employees. He never skips a shift or leaves his equipment behind." This isn't him at all. Jake requested more security guards to assist in the search for Carlos, and within half an hour, 6 officers were searching every part of Terminal 3, including the security offices, maintenance rooms, storage areas, and even the restricted areas that needed special clearance. Carlos Mendoza had just vanished, and it was Officer Patricia. While looking through security footage from earlier in the evening, Williams made the revelation that turned everything upside down. "Jake, you need to see this," Patricia said, calling him over to her monitor. "This is footage from camera 23, taken at 11:47 p.m., about 4 hours before you saw Carlos Mendoza was seen in the video cleaning next to gate K3. He was routinely emptying trash cans and mopping the floor when he abruptly stopped at 11:52 p.m. and turned to face the camera with a terrified expression on his face. "Your hooded figure. Watch what happens next," Patricia said on the screen as Carlos seemed to be staring at something that was just out of the camera's field of vision. His mouth was open, as though he was screaming, but the security cameras didn't record sound, so he kept backing away until he was out of the camera's line of sight. "That's the last footage we have of Carlos," Patricia said. However, as he watched, she moved to camera 47, which Jake had been watching when he first noticed the hooded figure. The timestamp on the monitor indicated 11:54 p.m., which was only 2 minutes after Carlos vanished from camera 23. Jake could see the hooded figure moving down the K concourse corridor, but he now knew where to look for. Jake observed something that he had overlooked earlier. The figure wasn't merely dodging the cameras. Instead, they were walking in precisely the same pattern that Carlos had been using for his cleaning route. "Patricia, could you improve the picture? I would like to see the hands of the hooded figure." When they saw this, both officers moved away from the monitor because the figure was holding a mop. "Jesus Christ," Jake muttered. "That's Carlos, not just a stranger." However, if Carlos was the hooded figure, why had he been dodging the cameras? Why had he looked scared in the previous video? And most significantly, where was he now? Jake went back to gate K4, where he discovered the wet tracks. Using a cotton swab from his first aid kit, Jake took a sample of the liquid from one of the footprints and examined them more closely with his flashlight this time. It was evident that the liquid was blood mixed with water control, and the prints weren't just wet. They had a reddish tint to them, as if the water had been mixed with something else. "I need a hazmat team at gate K." For the hazmat team arrived within 20 minutes and confirmed Jake's suspicion that the footprints contained human blood. A subsequent DNA analysis would confirm that the blood belonged to Carlos Mendoza, but Carlos was never located. "I need you to lock down Terminal 3 immediately and prevent anyone from entering or leaving until we figure out what happened here." Had been working alone in the KC concourse when he became so terrified that he left his tools behind and ran away. Security footage showed him backing away from an invisible threat before he just disappeared. Jake had seen a hooded figure that was actually Carlos, but something had happened to him between 11:52 p.m. and when he was discovered. He fled in fear, and at 11:54 p.m., when he was captured on camera with his mop and hood, something that had altered him caused him to avoid the security cameras he had never before noticed, which ultimately caused him to vanish. The wet, bloody footprints indicated that Carlos had been hurt, but there was no he couldn't explain what had happened to Carlos Mendoza. But he knew that something in Terminal 3's K concourse had the ability to make people disappear. The official report listed Carlos as missing, but Jake suspected the truth. The prince's trail of blood leading away from Gate K4 ended at the window, as if Carlos had walked through the glass and disappeared into the night. Jake asked to be transferred to day shift after that incident. The KCO and course at Terminal 3 was actually much more sinister. After the incident, it was temporarily closed for maintenance. When it reopened 2 weeks later, more security cameras had been installed, removing most of the blind spots the hooded figure had used to evade detection. However, security officers still occasionally report seeing a figure in a dark hoodie walking through the KCO and course carrying Carlos Mendoza's cleaning cart, is still waiting for him to return to complete his shift at O'Hare. The figure uses a mop and stays just out of clear camera range, never approaching passengers or interfering with airport operations. Instead, it repeatedly follows the same cleaning route as if it were stuck in an endless loop of the last task it was completing, before whatever happened at Gate K claimed it forever. But let's move on to our fifth story. Jake Thompson is aware that some shifts never end, and that some employees never get to go home. Tami Engen had been working night maintenance at LAX for 4 years, specializing in cleaning the inside of aircraft and doing small repairs. The job paid well, especially with the overnight differential, and Tami enjoyed the solitude that came with working while everyone else was asleep. He was meticulous in his work and took pride in making sure that every at 15 a.m. of a misty October night, Tami was assigned to thoroughly clean the interior of a Boeing 767 that had just finished a transatlantic flight from London. The aircraft, registered on 456AA, was parked at Gate 52 in Terminal 4 and was immaculate and prepared for the passengers of the following day. Tami entered the aircraft through the main cabin door, wheeling his cleaning cart behind him. The 767 was set up with 28 business class seats and 160 economy seats spread across a single aisle layout, and the cabin was dimly lit by emergency lighting, creating long shadows between the seats. Tami had cleaned this particular plane before it was part of American Airlines' regular London-Los Angeles route, and he knew its layout intimately. As Tami started his routine at the front of the aircraft and worked his way methodically toward the back, everything appeared to be going as usual. He vacuumed the carpets, wiped down the seats, cleaned the windows, and put new magazines and safety cards in the back pockets of the seats. The work was routine, almost meditative, and Tami found himself falling into the rhythm of his tasks. Tami first heard a soft, rhythmic breathing sound coming from somewhere behind him when he got to row 15 in the economy section. He stopped his vacuum cleaner and listened intently, and the breathing was steady and slow, like someone in deep sleep. But there was something labored about it, like the person was having trouble breathing. Tami turned around, expecting to see a passenger who had somehow been overlooked during deplaning. He yelled, "Hello, is someone there?" But the rows behind him were deserted, with every seat upright and showing no signs of occupancy. Tami continued cleaning after getting no reaction, thinking he had only imagined the sound, but a few minutes later, his breathing became more obvious, distinct than before, and it appeared to be coming from a few feet directly behind him. Tami quickly spun around, but this time he only saw empty seats. The breathing continued even as Tami stood motionless, listening, and it was unmistakably human, the sound of someone slowly exhaling and drawing air into their lungs, but the rhythm was off in some way. Tami decided to conduct a systematic investigation, walking through every row of the aircraft, checking under seats, overhead bins, and even the restrooms. The plane was completely empty except for him, but as soon as he went back to cleaning, the breathing resumed, always appearing to come from just behind. It was too slow and deep, as if whoever was breathing was doing so with great effort. Tami muttered to himself, "This is ridiculous," as he tried to explain what he was hearing. He thought that aircraft ventilation systems, particularly those of older aircraft like this 767, could produce odd noises. The breathing was most likely just air moving through the ducts in an odd way, but as Tami worked, the breathing became more noticeable. These weren't the sounds of an air conditioner. Rather, they were the breathing patterns of a living person. Tami was cleaning row 23 when the breathing abruptly stopped, and the ensuing silence was somehow more unnerving than the sound had been. He could hear not only the inhalation and exhalation, but also subtle rhythmic variations, sometimes faster, slower, and occasionally with a slight wheeze or catch. Tami waited and listened carefully, but all he could hear was the distant hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit. Then, just as Tommy was ready to go back to work, he heard a voice that was barely above a whisper coming from right behind him. "Excuse me." Tommy spun around so fast that he knocked over his cleaning supplies. A man in his 60s was standing in the aisle behind him. He was dressed in a rumpled business suit, looked very pale, had bloodshot eyes, and his chest was rising and falling with apparent effort. "Sir, you can't be here," Tommy said, his heart pounding. "This aircraft is out of service." "How did you join the team?" "I was sleeping, and I think I missed my stop." "Your stop, sir? This is an airplane, not a bus." "What's your name? Do you have a boarding pass?" the man asked Tommy, looking at him bewildered. He delved into his jacket pockets, and produced a crumpled boarding pass, which Tommy took and examined with his flashlight. The pass was for American Airlines Flight 136 from London to Los Angeles, seat to 3C, and it stated that the flight had landed 3 days prior, so you couldn't have been sleeping here for 3 days. The man scanned the cabin as though he was seeing it for the first time. 3 days? That's not possible. I briefly closed my eyes during the meal service, and Tommy saw that the man's breathing was getting harder by the minute. "Sir, are you feeling okay? Do you need medical attention?" the man remarked. "I'm just very tired. The doctor diagnosed me with pneumonia, but I thought I was improving." Tommy's maintenance training included basic first aid, and he saw that this man was in a lot of pain. His lips were bluish, and he was having a hard time breathing. "I'm going to call for medical assistance, sir." "What's your name?" Harold Brennan." "I don't know how I could have." Tommy was reaching for his radio after 3 days of sleep, and I remember the flight attendant serving dinner. Harold Brennan abruptly collapsed in seat to 3C, which was the seat on his boarding pass. His breathing became even more labored, and Tommy could see that he was in severe respiratory distress control. "This is Ingwan in aircraft and 456A at gate 52. I urgently need paramedics. There is a man named Harold Brennan here who claims to have been on the flight from London 3 days ago, but has been sleeping on the plane ever since." Tommy knelt next to Harold, who was having trouble breathing. The man's eyes were wide with panic, and he was gasping for air like a fish out of water. "I have a passenger in medical distress, Tommy." "What passenger?" "That aircraft was cleared hours ago," Harold whispered. "Help me. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. The paramedics are coming," Tommy assured him, but he wondered how long it would take them to get to the remote gate. Harold held Tommy's arm with unexpected strength, saying, "I was supposed to see my daughter in Los Angeles. She's getting married next week. I can't miss her wedding. You're going to be fine. I've been trying to get off this plane 4 days." But Harold's condition was obviously getting worse quickly. His voice was getting weaker, and every time I try to get out, I end up back in my seat because I can't seem to find the exit. Tommy looked toward the front of the plane, where the main cabin door was visible and still open from when he had entered. "Sir, the exit is right there, you see." Harold followed Tommy's gaze from this point on, but his expression remained confused. "I see nothing but darkness." The paramedics arrived 15 minutes later, but by then, Harold Brennan had completely stopped breathing. They attempted to revive him for almost an hour, but it was too late, and at 3:47 a.m., Harold was declared dead. The subsequent investigation uncovered troubling information regarding Harold Brennan's account. According to the flight manifest, he had actually been on Flight 136 from London 3 days prior, traveling to Los Angeles to attend his daughter's wedding. He was assigned to seat to 3C, which is precisely where Tommy had discovered him. But the flight crew, other passengers claimed that Harold Brennan had passed away, in accordance with standard protocol for in-flight fatalities. Flight attendants moved his body to an empty row and covered it with blankets after he suffered from severe pneumonia and experienced respiratory failure somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean during the flight. Harold's remains had been taken out of the coroner's office upon arrival in Los Angeles, and his daughter had been informed and taken to a nearby funeral home. After preparations were completed, Harold Brennan had been declared dead for 3 days when Tommy met him on the plane. The coroner verified that Tommy had actually spoken to Harold Brennan, but the body displayed decomposition indicators that were consistent with having been dead for 72 hours, and there was no medical reason why on that plane a dead guy might have been breathing, talking, and moving. Following the event, Tommy asked to be moved to day shift maintenance. He was unable to describe his experiences, but he was aware that Harold Brennan had managed to stay on flight 136. The dad was more determined to attend his daughter's wedding once his body was taken. Compared to death itself, the Boeing 767 was completely retired from service 2 weeks after the flight. It was inspected and thoroughly cleaned before returning to the London-Los Angeles route. According to attendants, there appeared to be ongoing issues with the air conditioning at seat to 3C. Many customers asked to be relocated to a different seat because they felt that the temperature was always too frigid. Although Tommy never again worked on that specific aircraft, he had heard from other maintenance personnel that occasionally discovered seat to 3C reclining even though the aircraft had been set up correctly for the subsequent flight, and sometimes cleaning staff reported hearing hard breathing coming from the vacant seat during the night, as if someone Harold Brennan reached his final breath because he was still having trouble breathing. Daughter's wedding, but he was permanently stuck on aircraft 136. Attempting to his respiration could still be heard throughout his entire trip to Los Angeles. The peaceful nighttime hours serve as a reminder that some travelers never actually disembark, and some flights seem to go on forever.